The 1st century BC had been a massive turning point for Rome and the Old World as a whole. It seems very poetic then that the turn of the century, the year 100 BC, would see the birth of the man destined to bring about that change, Gaius Julius Caesar. Caesar was born in an age of great troubles for the Roman Republic. Corruption, debauchery, and conflict plagued the republican institutions once held so dear by the Romans. The senatorial representatives, once models of Roman virtue who upheld the interests of all within the republic, now grew selfish and lazy. Power was increasingly being conceded to the uneducated pleb class, who themselves pursued self-enriching policies at the expense of long-term stability, and the systems of old could no longer keep up with the demands of territorial expansion. In his lifetime, Caesar would bear witness to the forceful ascension of Lucius Cornelius Sulla to the position of dictator, the first Roman to do so in the Republic's history. It was an act not conducted out of a mere desire for self-enrichment, but a necessary extreme undertaken for the sake of ensuring Rome's modernization and survival. And though Caesar himself did not sympathize with Sulla politically, his ascension and actions left a lasting impression upon the young man, who himself would one day seize the dictatorship by force. Sulla would eventually retire from the dictatorship, satisfied that he had corrected Rome's course. He would discourage others from taking the same extreme actions he had, wishing only that the Republic would carry on as it was supposed to. However, Sulla's actions had set a new precedent for Roman power, and once ambitious men realized how easily Sulla's tactics could be replicated, things would never be the same for Rome again. Caesar would negotiate an alliance known as the First Triumvirate with two other influential Romans, Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of if not the most wealthy men in all of Rome, and Pompey the Great, a general and politician who had been under the direct tutelage of General Sulla. Together the three were able to exploit constitutional checks and balances to strengthen one another's influence, Caesar in particular using the alliance to facilitate his conquest of Gaul, while Crassus set out to conquer Persia. Crassus, unlike Caesar and Pompey, did not carry very much military prestige behind him, and though they had been in an alliance, an unspoken rivalry existed between the three, and Crassus refused to be perceived as the weakest link of the alliance. A conquest of the Parthian Empire in Persia was sure to cement his place as an equal or greater member of the alliance. However, the invasion proved disastrous, costing Crassus his life and destabilizing the Triumvirate, which quickly devolved into a battle for supremacy between Caesar and Pompey, ultimately sparking a civil war. Caesar and the pro-plebeian popular faction stood on one side, whilst Pompey and the pro-patrician senatorial optimates stood on the other. Pompey's faction seeing support from the Parthians, who came to see Rome as a rival empire which needed to be destabilized and weakened at all costs. Pompey would be defeated, however, and Rome now stood securely under the sole leadership of Julius Caesar. Securely may not be the correct term, however, as while Caesar now stood unopposed by the Triumvirate, he was rather lenient with what enemies of his remained, and largely allowed them to retain their positions of power. As Caesar solidified his hold over Rome, so did these remaining enemies believe that something needed to be done before it was too late. Caesar may very well have been preparing to make himself a king, something wholly unacceptable in Roman culture, and to cement his status as king he would add one more great conquest to his name, the Parthian Empire. As revenge for the support of Pompey in the Civil War, to avenge the death of Crassus years before, to secure Rome from the sole imperial level threat on their border, and to surpass the empire of Alexander the Great, Persia would fall. But only days before his campaign was to begin, the treacherous senators lured Caesar into a trap and assassinated him there in the theater of Pompeii, plunging Rome into a new civil war. But what if that changed? What if in an alternate timeline, Caesar lived long enough to see his campaign through? In our world, Caesar had been repeatedly warned by those around him that his life was in danger and that he should avoid fellow politicians at all cost. Caesar was safest when surrounded by his legions who were devoutly loyal to him and stood to gain little or nothing from endangering his life. Politicians, on the other hand, held both ideological animosity towards Caesar and saw him as standing in the way of their own advancement. It is because of this that Caesar was advised to depart on his campaign early and leave politics in the hands of those closest to him. Had he heeded this advice, he would have been well on his way to Macedonia by the time of the assassination plot, possibly leaving someone else to be the target of the assassination, such as Marcus Antonius, though in all likelihood the plot would have simply dissolved, but that's not to say that Caesar's enemies would have been placated. For Macedonia, Caesar would first invade and conquer the kingdom of Dacia. Neutralizing this region had been crucial, as while the kingdom posed a minor threat to Rome overall, it was a belligerent kingdom and Caesar could not afford needing to divert attention and manpower away from what would be a very demanding front against Persia. Thus, neutralizing Dacia beforehand would be the best option strategically and would open up access to resources and auxiliaries from this conquered land. The Dacian king had been assassinated not long after Caesar had in our timeline, destabilizing the country and making it all the easier to conquer this time around. From conquered Dacia, Caesar could be expected to sail across the Black Sea, arriving in eastern Anatolia before making his way to Armenia, from where the invasion of Parthia would be launched. In our timeline following Caesar's assassination, Marcus Antonius had attempted to carry out the invasion of Persia himself. However, Antonius was nowhere near the tactical expert Caesar had been, and rushed into combat hastily, succumbing to Parthian archer tactics which absolutely destroyed his forces even despite having had superior numbers and weaponry. His supply trains were separated from his main force, allowing them to be destroyed by the Parthians, who then drove Antony into retreat. But this time, things are different. Assuming Caesar advances upon Parthia with a similar force as Antonius, he would have behind him an army 100,000 strong. Caesar was well acquainted with archer tactics for the time, having employed them himself in the conquest of Gaul as well as faced them in combat during that same campaign. The more advanced tactics employed by the Parthians would likely catch Caesar off guard upon his first encounter, but given his history for quick thinking, would adapt to such tactics and not make the same mistakes Antonius had. The Parthians at this time were only years away from experiencing a major succession crisis and civil war, and the added strain of an effective campaign against them is only likely to expedite these issues, allowing Caesar to make significant gains in his first few years. As he advanced further into Persian lands, the Parthians would likely seek assistance from Scythia to the north. In our world, Scythian lands had been a reliable source of surplus soldiers and archers for Persia, these nomad auxiliaries having played an important part in tilting the dynastic feud which had rocked Persia in our timeline. It has been suggested that Caesar's conquest would not merely stop at Persia, but extend further to practically all European lands east of Rome. Of course, it seems like an exaggeration, but one account does suggest Caesar's plan following the fall of Persia was to advance northward into Scythia, conquer the western steppe, advance into Germania, conquer that, and finally return to Rome in a full circuit. This is clearly a massive undertaking and certainly a stretch even for Caesar. However, if the opportunity were to present itself, it does seem likely that Caesar would and could conquer at least the western steppe, in addition to Persia. If we assume the Parthians flee north and continue conducting war from Scythia, this would pose a continuous threat to the recently conquered Persia. The steppe is of course largely flat lands, meaning that there aren't many obstacles in the way of a rapid sweep through the region. Caesar even has 3 invasion routes, one being the Caucasus, which are mountainous and very difficult to traverse, but the other 2 are the Black and Caspian Seas, the former of which Rome already controls at both ends. With that in mind, a conquest of Persia would almost certainly be followed by a conquest of Scythia, with the Caucasus being claimed as a client territory post-war, as they would now be fully encircled by Rome. Caesar would return to Rome victorious, his status as dictator now solidified by his tremendous conquests, but much would have transpired in his absence. While Caesar was away, his enemies would have almost certainly attempted to retake power for the Senate, much against the wishes of the pleb majority, which was largely loyal to Caesar. Civil war would break out between the Caesarian and senatorial factions, the former being led by Marcus Antonius and Octavian. Such a civil war had broken out in our world, but in this alternate timeline conditions are extremely different. For one, the so-called liberators who had assassinated Caesar came to occupy the eastern provinces and use those armies against the Caesarians in the west. This would not be possible if Caesar himself was presently in the east, utilizing the legions of those provinces against Parthia. Had they attempted to do so, they would be dramatically outnumbered by the Caesarians, who had tremendous support from the western legions, and would only compromise Caesar's war effort by giving the Parthians a weak link to exploit. Alternatively, the liberators could attempt to seize control of some western legions, but no matter how you slice the situation, nothing appears optimal for this faction. In our world, they had been defeated with an equal number of legions to the Caesarians, and any reduction would only make their defeat all the more certain. The only event I could see shifting things in senatorial favor would be if Marcus Antonius had been assassinated instead of Caesar, leaving the defense of the West largely in the hands of Octavian. Even if this were to happen, the odds aren't terribly against Octavian, and a victory could still be drawn if the liberators remain outnumbered. Caesar's return would be celebrated with 2 triumphs, one for his conquest of Parthia and another for his conquest of Scythia, giving him a grand total of 6, twice as many as Pompey had achieved in his lifetime, and more than any other Roman before him. With his enemies defeated by his most trusted general and his adopted heir, Caesar would set about reforming Rome unchallenged, mimicking many of these centralizing policies his successor Octavian would have adopted in our world, which ultimately transformed the Roman Republic into the Roman Empire. The provinces would have their government standardized and made beholden to Rome's centralized ruler. The Senate would be made largely powerless and dependent upon Caesar, much as had occurred under Octavian, while promoting a new social order that would weaken the status of the existing elites, allowing him to raise or demote from office both members of the patrician and pleb class. He himself would assume a semi-regal title much like Octavian had done to avoid the stigma associated with royalty in Roman culture, while still distinguishing himself as the leading central figure of the country. Various national works would be undertaken, including the creation of a Roman equivalent to the Library of Alexandria and a massive temple to the god Mars, not to mention various canal and water projects, including the expansion of the harbor in Caesar's rebuilt city of Carthage, and the draining of various swamplands to create new arable land for settlement. With the empire stabilized, its greatest enemies, both foreign and domestic, having been defeated, and Rome now on course toward prosperity, Caesar would feel a deep pride. He had built an empire which surpassed that of even Alexander the Great in size and strength, and while that empire had died with its founder, Caesar would ensure through the creation of a new succession code that such would not occur for Rome. Octavian, Caesar's heir, would be made a junior emperor ruling in the recently conquered East, to learn firsthand what it takes to rule over and assimilate a rebellious and resistant population. Caesar's work would not be finished, however. It was once written that Caesar would not see the empire secure until Rome stood surrounded by water to the south, west, and north. This specifically bringing to attention the savage lands of Germania, which remained a present threat on Rome's border, and which before his death, Caesar would see brought under total Roman control. The US of Z thanks you for watching. Many thanks to Bulgarian Empire Mapping for animating today's video. Be sure to check his channel out, and if you enjoyed this style of video, let us know and we might just make this a regular thing. Support your legion by liking the video, or join our ranks by subscribing for more. Mr. Z, out.